So I'm assuming that I have everybody's permission to record. I just need to say that just for.
Yeah.
Everybody's okay with recording this session? For everyone else, thank you very much indeed. Okay. So the only thing we have to bear in mind is that we can all hear Judith, but Judith might not be able to hear us. So as the conversation goes on, it might be that if we have a question or if there's any point we want to make, then I can either say it into the laptop, or if you wanted to approach and say it into the laptop. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Great. So yeah, there was a range. We kind of touched on it a little bit. So it fed into the start of the workshop, Judith. So we just started exploring or trying to put into words our kind of reactions, I suppose, our emotional reactions to the climate emergency. So yeah, everybody had different ones that they came up with. Would it be okay to ask people to maybe tell Judith what their reaction was, if you want to expand on it in any way? Otherwise, it's just me reading out the word, but it might come better from the person who said it. So is it okay to approach the monitor to do that? I can put it sort of here, if that makes it any better. So one of the first ones, well, a really good one was that came up was exhausted, feeling exhausted, which was, yeah.
I need to get over.
If that's okay, yeah. And you can just kneel down, Bobby.
Hello, I'll impress Judith.
Hi.
Hi. So yeah, one of the things that I said, among many others, was this feeling of exhaustion about everything to do with climate change, with the way it's interpreted in the media, with the overuse of the word, but then also the inability to feel like you're doing much about it. And a little bit further into that is that exhaustion of almost fighting between trying to do something and then feeling like you're not going to get anywhere with it as well. So it's an exhaustion that you feel sort of almost daily, but it's that peaks and troughs which also exhaust you even more, in terms of you have that highlight of like, yes, I'm doing something, things are going somewhere, and then that almost feels immediately followed by something where you just feel like you're getting nowhere at all. I'm gonna get back up now and move back.
Well, actually, thank you for expressing so beautifully, I think, a very common experience. I mean, not everybody will have this, but I think you've really hit on something very important, speaking about the exhaustion of the roller coaster of emotions between feeling you're acting and then feeling overwhelmed by how small it feels. And yeah, I'm sure a lot of people, if they can't relate to that now, they'll find themselves in that state at some point or other and be glad it was spoken. So thank you.
Anyone else like to
Yeah, well, I'll take it too. Hi, Julie.
Hello.
So I mentioned reactions like frustration and worries, because to me, seeing what's going on, I'm kind of, my hobbies are hiking in the nature. So when I'm seeing glaciers or the nature in general, what's happening to the ocean, I have more the feeling that we might be already too late. And we had this, it was everywhere in the media, and my feeling is also that everything that is expected now with the net zero is too much. So the stat is just too huge, and we might not get there what they're all planning. Yeah. So that's.
Thank you. And you haven't used these words, but I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, but I'm picking up some despair in what you're saying, and also grief at what you're seeing, the change in the glaciers and the oceans. Does that get what you're saying, as well as the frustration. And I'm hearing some anger behind the frustration, maybe.
Maybe, yeah.
Okay. Not
Yeah.
for everybody, but maybe somebody's got some anger here.
Yeah, definitely. Anger is also one reaction of somebody.
Yeah. Anybody here switching off? No? Okay. Or wanting to switch off?
I would like to switch up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would like to. I feel like I can't. I think that adds to the exhaustion of feeling like you have some kind of necessity to do something about it, because you know that there's a thing, and it's almost that anxiety of stopping is just as strong as the like exhaustion from it. So then you're fighting with it all the time. But yeah, I think about it every day, like how easy it would be to just stop and to give up.
Mm.
But
Mm.
then that fear, I think fear for me as well is fear that I will get to that place one day where I'll just be like, actually, you know what it is, I've done as much as I can, and that's that. So I think some of my fear with climate change isn't just the actual effects and the impact it will have, it's the fear that I'll suddenly stop.
Mm.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Do you want to touch on anything in that, Dan, as well?
Partly, I think it's kind of a big conflict of emotion, and I think there's certainly anger in there, because you think, why are we focusing on something so far away? But I think there's a certain amount of guilt that I personally have as well, and you kind of look at your own choices and be like, God, you know, if only I'd woken up last night, then I wouldn't be wasting all of this plastic today. And I know it's only one day, but actually it was 4 days last week. And you just constantly have that in the back of your mind, chewing away at you, just to try and do that a little bit better. And like, so sorry, I've completely forgotten your name. When you say you kind of wish that you could just stop thinking about it for a second. Sophie, sorry. But it is just there, just chewing away constantly in the back of your mind, and it is exhausting.
I think what might be useful to hear is, Dan, you work in ethical finance, don't you? So Dan works in ethical finance, I hope the man just said there, and then I work in property development, but in sustainability. So something that at first I thought was really good, because it's something I'm passionate about, I can almost impact from the inside outwards. Dan obviously working in ethical finance, which he will likely see people coming forward and saying, well, I've got this big project, it needs funded in this kind of way. That I don't think that helps the issue, and feeling like sometimes I want to give up, and then you can't, and that feeling forward of emotion probably happens just as much as anybody else, but because we then have to continue at work as well in that kind of way, it's not always helpful.
Mm. Mm. Okay. So I'm in your hands, really. I can talk about different aspects of the psychology of climate change, including everything that comes under the heading of eco-anxiety. I mean, I can talk about this for England, you know. So one thing I could start with is the kind of things that I often say to people who are anxious about climate change. What I could also do, if it would be helpful for you, is step back a bit and put the eco-anxiety aspect of climate change into the context of a number of other psychological issues, sort of give that frame. So I'd quite like to be guided by you about where to go. If you would like me to make just for a few minutes, just a sort of broader context of the different aspects of the psychology of climate change, I think that might be quite helpful. But I would also like to share with you some sort of practical tips as well as, you know, understandings of where we are. And actually, before I do that, I want to say that everything that everybody has said so far, and I know there'll be a lot of other unspoken feelings, is totally understandable. And in fact, I share many of those feelings at different times. And I also wonder about people who don't have any feelings about, I don't know what's going on for them. And broadly, we are having these feelings because we care, because it matters to us. And I think that's what's really important. Let me just step back and give you a sort of tiny mini lecture, if you don't mind, about the different ways that climate change impacts our psychology. And some of it you might not have heard of. And one way it impacts our psychology is actually the impact of temperature change on mental health. And not many people talk about this, but this is really important. Wherever we live in the world, we get used to a particular range of temperatures within which we function. And when temperatures go up beyond that, our bodies don't adjust, and there are lots of physical aspects to that, you know, physical impacts of rising temperatures, but there are also mental health impacts. And this is particularly with people who are very vulnerable, so people with dementia or people who are on very strong drugs for any form of psychosis are affected. Partly because they don't recognize when they're thirsty, and they also may not have adequate self-care strategies. But also there's increasing violence with greater temperatures and increasing suicide. And that's a physical effect of the increase in temperature. And that's one aspect of the impacts of climate change. Another aspect is the effects on people's mental health and emotional well-being of the traumas that come with climate change. And those fall into two parts. So, or we can see them in two ways. One is the kind of effects of climate change that go on year after year. So, for example, if you're a farmer and the first year of drought, you might have enough stores, but if there's drought after drought and you have poor crops after poor crops, that leads to mental health issues because you're losing your livelihood. Similarly with repeated floods, but also with things like floods and fires, you're going to have an impact of a sudden trauma, if you like. If you think about the people who in California or in Siberia or in Greece at the moment, particularly around Athens, where they're having to vacate their homes, they're sometimes seeing their homes go up in smoke. In this country, the mental health impacts of climate change are very much the storms and the floods, and the kind of impacts that you can imagine, the psychological impacts of what's happened in Germany, for example. Now, meteorologists in this country have been saying for 20 years that the main climate change impacts in Northern Europe are going to be floods and storms. And of course, this is what we're seeing. And those who study the health impacts of climate change have suggested that in this country, the main health impacts will be through the post-traumatic impacts of floods and storms. And I just really want to say that, and that's the impact of climate change itself. And if you think about the people who are most affected, you get places, for example, in the Lake District where the floods several times in the last decade. And of course, you get people who can't reinsure their businesses or their houses. And so massive financial impacts, dislocation. I think there are people, I might be wrong about this, but for many years after the floods in Carlisle, there were people still living in caravans. There will be people who've been flooded in this country, for example, in the Doncaster area, who are still dislocated, months and years on. So I don't want us to forget about those different psychological aspects. And then we come on to this whole heading that's called eco-anxiety. And eco-anxiety is so much a shorthand. Of course, anxiety is probably an accurate word because we get anxious when we're under threat. And this is a wake-up call. They're talking in the headlines about code red and alarm. But it does, as you've so beautifully, eloquently described, it encompasses times when we're angry and frustrated and despairing and full of grief at what's happening, not just because of climate change, but because of this perfect storm of environmental degradation and species extinction and climate change. So grief, anxiety, fear. And I do want to name how it is particularly difficult for our young people. Because, I'm 70 next year. And although I've been living with the threat of climate change consciously, probably for the last 15 years of my life, I've had a life that hasn't been dominated by climate change and its actual impacts. Now, I want you to think about, and you may have people in your own families, the impact of the news about climate change and the awareness about climate change on people who are just setting out in their lives, who are beginning to wonder, will I ever be able to have children? Is there a life? What is the point of going to university if this is what's happening? And one of the things that we're finding, and you will see the video by my colleague Caroline Hickman, who's done she's had so many conversations with children and young people all over the world. One of the great experiences they have is that this is happening and the adults haven't stepped up and the leaders haven't stepped up. And of course, you hear this cry very eloquently expressed by somebody like Greta Thunberg. Now, Greta has consulted with the best scientists in the world. So when she talks about the science, she's been very well briefed. But I want to really, just for us to be aware of the coming generations. And in a way, that's my invitation is to you as the bigger picture of what you're doing in having a climate assembly for this locality, for this city, is actually is for the future. And of course, that's what the strikes are for the future. There are now psychologists for the future who are supporting the schools' climate strikes. And there are scientists for the future who are supporting that voice of young people. And that in a way is the invitation to you, and your calling in a sense in this moment is to take part and to play your part in helping some kind of transition to something that will save what we can save. I didn't know I was going to say that, but I found myself saying it. So, but coming back to eco-anxiety and all its separate cousins, one of the things that's very, very important is that we don't get stuck in one particular emotion, that we learn to recognize what the emotions are, but be prepared to move to different emotions. Sometimes when we go on feeling angry, it's a way of dealing with the grief. The anger keeps us motivated and busy and in a kind of warrior, heroic like state. But it's actually quite important that we feel the grief and that we know what the anxiety feels like. And we work through those stages of different emotions. All emotions are welcome, but if we try and push some away, they'll come back and bite us. That's the human nature, we can't push all the feelings away. What's actually very, very important in a group like yours and in your communities is to recognize that actually different people will be in a different emotional state at different times. It's very well known that when grief hits a family, people go through grief in different ways and in different stages. And sometimes, very sadly, there can be conflict between parents at the different stages of grief. One person's getting on running a charity and the other's feeling paralyzed with their grief and loss. And the one who's very active can't understand why the other one is just sitting there weeping. And the one who's weeping can't understand and feels that the other person's forgetting. And that can often cause conflict. And in the same way, in climate-aware communities and groups, it's so important to be very respectful of where each of you are in your different feelings. Just also to bring you some wisdom from a couple of people who did some research into the feelings of climate activists. And I'm just getting some notes up so that I don't lose that. Where am I? So I just need to consult something else on the screen. So there's a way in which there's a very well recognized cycle of different feelings where when we first learn about climate change, and this often happens to people who perhaps joined XR or they joined Greenpeace or they signed up for Friends of the Earth, there's that point where you suddenly wake up and it's very common for there to be a sort of total immersion and preoccupation, and it's with you all the time. But then sometimes there's a kind of stage of burnout, and that can be very, very painful, where it just feels impossible to go on. And then things have to be reconsidered. But then perhaps there's a different kind of way of addressing, a more sustainable way. And I think that's enormously important, because the thing about climate change is that it's a long emergency. It absolutely is an emergency, and it is absolutely vital, as the new Climate Crisis Advisory Group has told us, who is a slimmer, faster committee that's been set up by Sir David King, who chaired Independent SAGE, and he's now set up the Climate Crisis Advisory Group. And actually they've, in their meetings recently, which are public, and I do recommend them because it's very, very accessible material, they're saying the same things that the IPCC are saying. We have to bend the curve of our carbon dioxide emissions. We should have been bending the curve into a reduction phase years ago. We haven't. The later we leave it, the steeper the drop has to be. And yet it's a long emergency. And that means, paradoxically, I'm going to say to you that it really is all right not to think about climate change some of the time. This is, I don't really like the imagery, but this is a long campaign. It's not a single battle, if you want some sort of warrior or hero images. When that dam nearly broke in Whaley Bridge, not far from where you are, the guy who found the leak absolutely had to panic, because he saw the leak and he went for the phone to call the emergency services. But when the emergency services came, and the army, I think, were involved in dropping boulders of the right size, they were acting to the nearest inch. You know, they had to be very precise and focused. And they also had to take time off to be fed. So the local community was setting up kitchens and places where these people could sleep, you know. So even in that dire emergency, self-care was allowed. And I think that's really, really important. When you're in an emergency, you put your own oxygen mask on before you put somebody else's on. And I can't emphasize this enough. I spend quite a lot, I'm retired, semi-retired, so although I'm still working a bit, I have the privilege of you know, having my old age pension and a bit of an NHS pension. So I have time to focus on climate psychology, and I chair the Climate Psychology Alliance. I take weekends off often, completely off. I often don't do much work on a Monday. I walk in the hills, I walk in the Yorkshire moors and the dales, and I go very slowly at the weekends. And I know that when I do that, I can keep going week after week, week after week, doing the work that I do for climate change. And I worry about colleagues who get to a point of burnout. So it really is all right. And when I'm talking about radical self-care, really. I'm not talking about sort of luxuries. I'm talking about absolutely making sure that you're eating healthily, that you're remembering to eat, that you're remembering to drink plenty of water, that you're exercising, that you're taking enough time off to dance or whatever it is, or to watch a game of football, or whatever it is that is actually your way of unwinding. Some very practical things. It's very, very important not to be on our screens looking at climate change news late at night. I don't. I do it some of the time. You know, I've been doing it recently just to find out what's happening. But actually, I know it's not actually good for me, and I'm not a better person the next day to do my work. So make some really strong boundaries for yourself. And although we're terribly aware of how the world has switched off from this for lots of understandable reasons, there is a way in which it can be a very effective. There is something called a functional dissociation, which is a kind of, it really is all right to switch off in order to be able to function some of the time. And I'd really like to encourage that. I'm going to stop now and perhaps take questions. I've probably been speaking enough. Does any of what I've said make some sense to you? It's I wish I was in the room with you, but you're a bit far away for me to travel to Manchester.
Has anybody got any questions or thoughts or
comments? Yeah.
Comments? Yeah, anything like to share?
Really liked the phrase long emergency. That was very well put. I've not heard that phrase before or thought of that phrase. I thought that was quite a useful thing to just way of thinking, way of framing things, take it away, rather than an immediate emergency.
A long emergency, yeah.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah.
I really like the point about like it's okay to switch off. I think sometimes I do switch off, but I feel almost ashamed that I'm doing it. I'm embarrassed that I'm not one of the parties nagging about how serious it is, checking my phone, looking up the news. And it's nice to say that like you cannot think about days and that's fine.
Did you hear that okay?
Yes, I did, yeah.
Okay. Well, it's so we've got I mean, I've wanted to do a bit of a roundup at the end, but so we've still got a good 10, 15 minutes. So yeah, you talked about kind of tips, of which we've discussed about kind of switching off and things, but I was wondering about talking to other people and, talking to children or grandchildren or family members or anything like that you might want to share with us, Judith.
Oh gosh, yeah. What's really important is that, children get taught about climate change when they're 7 in primary school. I don't know if you were aware of that. I had this about 18 months ago around Christmas. I was visiting some of my family, and I was aware that my grandson was switching lights off a lot. And it's lovely when kids remember to switch lights off, but this was, I'd go upstairs to fetch something and he'd switch the light off, and I really needed it on for coming back downstairs. And the next time I went round, we were playing football as you have to do this, and I've forgotten which team I was, but it was one of the losing teams in the World Cup, and he was in one of the winning teams. And I said, "Tell me what's going on when you switch the lights off, Charlie." And he said, "Well, Granny, if we don't switch the lights off, the Arctic is melting, and the Antarctic, and the polar bears will die." Now, he was talking about what he'd been taught about climate change, age 7, and he was taking it seriously, and he was clearly feeling responsible. And I'm not sure that 7-year-olds should be feeling responsible for what grown-ups haven't done. At the same time, we can't stop them being aware of climate change. And so there is a lot of really good material, and I will send you, Bob, a PDF which I can share with, which you please share with the group. And it's actually something that Caroline Hickman put together for London Climate Action Week about a month ago, that was very much focused on the role of schools. Because actually, although I've expressed my reservations, schools are a very important part of the community. And if schools act together in a sustainable way, that can actually have a big impact on a community. And Caroline has written some beautifully wise things about how to communicate with children about climate change. She tells the story of asking one child, "How do you want me to talk about climate change with you?" And the little girl, probably about 9 or 10, says something like, "Well, first of all, I want you to tell me the truth, otherwise I won't trust you." And then she said, "I want you to tell me, when you've told me some bad news, can you tell me some good news before you tell me another bit of bad news?" So that's really important. The other thing that's very important is that when kids are worried about climate change, we don't dismiss their feelings. And so that's where schools have to work Are any of you teachers, by the way? Am I talking to anybody in the room is teacher? No, okay. So very important, actually, that when schools are talking about climate change or becoming eco schools, or doing a lot, getting solar panels, sourcing the food sustainably, all that sort of thing, that they involve the parents, because there's nothing worse than a child coming home worried about climate change and parents saying, "Well, you don't need to worry about that." Let me tell you, there are people who go to psychotherapists who are told, "Oh, you don't need to worry about that." My head is in my hands, you know. But back to children. Children feel very isolated if they're told that their worries aren't valid. We feel isolated if we're told that our worries aren't valid. And so what's really important is that parents say something like, yes, it is worrying, and I'm really pleased you care about it. What can we do together? Now, I'm summarizing, you know, what can we do? So the child doesn't feel alone. And that's vitally important. I think a different version of that is important for all of us. We need to find our own communities, our own groups, where we feel safe to be talking about climate change, to be honest, to share our worries, our fears. Because there will be places where, even though this report has come out, that people will be trying to, there'll be the kind of, oh, it'll get sorted out. There's also, there's the greenwashing strategy, where all we've got to do is to get to net zero by 2050. Well, actually, that's too late, really. We've got to act much sooner. There will also be people, there'll be voices coming in denying this, in the same way that there are very different perspectives on, I can see all of you wearing your masks, but as you know, there are some places where people aren't wearing masks. Similar voices, often coming from a very similar perspective politically. And so it's actually important for our sanity that we have spaces where we can be as honest as we can about how we're feeling, and that we're acting in community. One of the most important thing for me about being chair of Climate Psychology Alliance is that every week I turn up to a weekly management meeting. We actually call it the heart group, because we sort of feel we're the heart of the organisation, which is a bit inflated. But I'm showing up with 4 or 5 other people, and we always start with a check-in. And we also make it very clear, if one of us is struggling with a piece of our responsibility, we're open about it. We fess up. We say, you know, I said I'd do this and I haven't. Can I talk about this? Can I? And so, you know, at the moment, one of our members is busy writing their PhD, and it is perfectly all right that she hasn't been to meetings for a few weeks. It's absolutely fine, because she's finalising. So we've got a small community of care that I'm immersed in every week. And frankly, it's one of my survival strategies to be in this group. And so try not to be doing too much stuff on your own. That's really important. With family and friends who don't get this stuff, one of the things I would recommend is that you do try to listen, because one of the things we found is that initially, obviously, there are some people who want to keep their head in the sand and absolutely don't want to move at all. But one of the experiences we have in different contexts is the kind of conversation that goes something like, well, oh, I don't know about this climate change stuff, you know, perhaps it's a load of rubbish. And of course, it's very easy to come in and argue, and then you leave a space, and then somebody will say, but it's really weird the daffodils are coming up earlier each year, isn't it? You know, so what appears to be an absolute denial to begin with often isn't. And a research colleague of ours in America did some work in a place where there was a lot of environmental degradation in the Great Lakes. And she writes about what she calls the myth of apathy, where it's assumed that people are apathetic, but actually when you talk to them, they're very aware of the degradation of the environment. And similarly, they're very aware of climate change, but quite often they feel disempowered to do anything and they feel hopeless. And so giving offhand comments is a way of managing that. They're not apathetic and they're not really in denial, but they need space for their particular take on what they've noticed and what they've seen. So I'd encourage listening and trying not to fall out within your families if you can, even though that's difficult at times.
Anyone else got any other questions or any thoughts for Judith about this, or perhaps the emotions that we came up with when we touched on it earlier? One of the things that I did put up just before, just during the break, was Caroline's presentation. There's a slide with really small writing, but a really good slide of the sort of the roller coaster of the person and where they start.
Oh, I know that slide. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I tried to explain it as best I could, but I don't know if you have anything that you can expand on that.
I'm going to give you, if I can find it, a simpler one. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, no, I can't. It's all right. It's always a problem if somebody asks you a question, you can't find it. I think the important thing is actually if you can do a printout of that. Has Caroline sent you that slide, the slide presentation, Bob?
She sent me a presentation of it. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it would be really good if you actually printed that slide out for people just as a single sheet, because you can do that, because it's the kind of, it's not a good slide, but it's quite good as a diagram in a book. Yeah. And I think what it's about is finding that point of sustainability, of not going round. I mean, it's a linear diagram and I'm talking about spirals, but not moving from this sort of total immersion into burnout and then back into total immersion and back into, burnout again. We have to get out of that spiral. And I think we get out of that spiral through self-care, through community, and community can be 2 or 3 of you. Also through absolutely recognizing what's your superpower, what is it that you're good at, and what is it that other people are good at, and don't try to do everything. Let me give you a personal example. I live in a Joseph Rowntree development, and Joseph Rowntree was chocolate and charitable trusts, and somebody invited me 6 months ago. Would I chair the Action on Climate Change Committee in my development? And I just said no, because my thing is not action on climate change. I mean, not that I don't act on climate change, but my specialty is the psychology of climate change and running an organization which is promoting that and supporting people like you. So if I was having committees about solar panels, I wouldn't be able to show up to talk to you tonight. And so it was very easy for me to say no, because I'd absolutely got my vision and my focus there. Some of the time I'm not so good at saying no, but it's really important. What's the thing you're really good at, and then respecting what somebody else is really good at, so that you can actually work as a team within whichever groups you're working with, about who's good at doing the backroom stuff, you know, who's good at doing the public facing, who's good at doing the networking. Don't try and do everything, because it's such a, sometimes it's so pressing, and people are involved. They're involved in Greenpeace and the Green Party and XR, and then they burn out and they have to stop for a year, you know. So find your superpower, but remember to take a holiday from it. And the other thing is that we are going to need, I've talked about needing community for eco-anxiety. We are going to need strong communities as climate change hits us. You know, it's hitting the world, but as you know, the impact report from the IPCC will come out, and I've no doubt that some of it will talk about what's going to happen when bread baskets fail. You know, the wheat crop, or the global rice crop, or whatever. What's going to happen? We're going to need strong communities. We're going to need communities that are cohesive, in the same way that in some places, through COVID, communities became very focused on self-help and working out who needed some shopping doing. Didn't work everywhere, but there are some places that where people really stepped up to act in community, to be a resource. And we absolutely take that and multiply it a dozen times for the kind of deep community democratic structures that we're going to need at a local level for climate change. I told you I can't stop talking when you get me started, Bob. That was such a good question.
That's quite all right. Well, we're coming to the end of the session, but I mean, we've got time for any other comments or thoughts, or maybe one more question or anything like that, if we can think of any at the moment. It has been quite a night of it, so there's been a lot to sort of process, a lot to think about.
You guys are meeting for the first time, aren't you?
That's right.
Absolutely. My goodness, what an evening you've had.
But yeah, it's the first step of forming that group, I suppose. And so we talked about the importance of holding a confidential space, and for people to feel comfortable in sharing things that they might not be able to share in other circumstances or with other people. So it's not every day you get to talk about the emotional impacts of climate change with people, because it's not something you can communicate easily, but it's also like it's not something that a lot of people want to hear either. And so finding a space for that is crucial, like you say, in moving forwards and coming up with proactive responses and having that sort of sustainable action. But yeah, it's not always freely available. So I'd hope that these workshops over the next few weeks and beyond will help with that process.
Well, I wish you very well, Bob, and everybody here in that endeavour, and your other groups, and presumably then all the groups come together at some point.
That's right, yeah. So that happens in a few weeks' time. We'll all meet up in city centre location.
Yeah.
Where we can kind of figure out what impact we can have as a whole.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, indeed.
Big pleasure, Bob.
Yeah.
And I'll send you the recording, and I might well send you some sort of accessible references to back up what I've been saying. You've probably got some from Caroline as well, but you know.
Yeah, send it on over anyway, because yeah, if it doubles up with Caroline's, then that's fine. We'll just use one, but if not, then it's another resource that we've got.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So if you want to wave the ball.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Bye.
Thank you very much, Judith. I'll talk to you again soon.
Okay. Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.